I understand that you were asked to submit your plans and actions, no? Should you be appointed to the position. For the benefit of the public, can you give us in brief and summarize to us the plans and actions that you have submitted? Thank you.
Okay, good morning, by the way. Yes, we were asked to submit an action plan for the Office of the Ombudsman covering both short-term and long-term plans. So for the short-term plan, you know, whenever you enter a new organization, the first thing you have to do, I think, is take stock of what it's like in the organization. So you would want to conduct an initial assessment and evaluation of the current state of the office in terms of personnel, status of cases, budget utilization, savings, IT, capabilities, training needs, and the like. So it's important to get a stock of those things because it's very difficult to come into an organization not knowing anything and think you know everything. I think there has to be that process first where you try and learn how things work, what the culture is, and so on. Now, this is done not only to address immediate needs and not only for you to know what it's like in the organization, but also as a preparatory step to a strategic plan that you would want for at least the 7-year term that you are there. So this includes looking at, for example, rules of procedure to ensure they're still consistent with Supreme Court rulings and the like. Ensuring, for example, that you know, there's a system of prioritization in the Ombudsman, and you want to ensure that cases involved or investigations on pressing issues proceed as planned. I think we're all familiar with the flood control issues and the issue on the construction in Baguio. So I think those should be looked at right away, as in the short term, of course. And and in some cases, we've heard about ghost projects. So these are actually low-hanging fruits because if it's a ghost project, then it should be relatively easier to prove than other cases. It's also important to visit the personnel. The Ombudsman has offices in some areas in the country, so I think it's important for the Ombudsman to show his face there and get to know the people. It's part of learning about the culture that exists in the Office of the Ombudsman. And then there are others, you know, about strengthening existing offices, finding out what their problems are. At the same time, you want to know if, you know, there are training needs, if they need to advance in digitalization, maybe the use of AI. Also, strengthening partnerships. Partnerships can be with government agencies, can be with other stakeholders. So with government agencies, the Ombudsman, meron siyang mga MOA. But I think you have to go beyond just the memorandum of agreement, beyond the paper, and make sure that there is really some synergy that exists when you have these relationships. For example, with COA or NBI or the Department of Justice. Also, stakeholders include the general public. I think the Ombudsman has or has had programs involving schools and communities. So it would be interesting to see whether these are still there and whether these are worth continuing. Because when you talk about fighting corruption, you're talking about the whole, not just a whole of government approach, but a whole of nation approach. I don't think any single agency can solve the problem of corruption. And of course, I think something media wants to hear is you'd want to review the rules on the disclosure of SALN, you know, and see. I think there's a need to strike a balance somewhere between the right of the public to know, which is actually in the Constitution and in the law itself, but also the, you might say, limited rights of government employees. You know. Now, long-term strategies will depend primarily on the strategic plan, what comes out of it. It's difficult to foresee what would be there, although you could take stock that you would want to see whether programs or projects that are working become institutionalized, so that way, even when you're not there, these projects and programs, if they're worth pursuing, continue. Another would be something very important, I think, that's overlooked is one of the powers of the Ombudsman is to determine causes for inefficiency, red tape, misallocations, and graft, corruption, fraud, etc., similar to what the ARTA, or the Anti-Red Tape Authority, does. And I think it's very important to be able to work with ARTA, because I've seen the work of ARTA, and I don't think it's something that current resources of the Office of the Ombudsman could do. And I think it's an area that may have been neglected. But I think there's, it would add a bit more teeth to what ARTA does if, there could be some collaboration with the Office of the Ombudsman. And then, of course, probably other things there would be develop new programs. I'm thinking maybe something like a citizen participation program. We had one in COA where ordinary citizens would assist in certain types of performance audit. Here, maybe assist to some extent in investigations. It would be good because it could also provide transparency and could help engender a greater trust in the institution. And then, of course, the usual capacitation, improving facilities, and the like, probably on the long term. At the end of the day, what you want in the long term is some kind of transformation to make it more effective, more efficient, maybe more economical. Yun lang po.
I think it is safe to assume that one of the most pressing concern of the public or observation of the public, rightly or wrongly, is that the current administration is assumed to appoint someone which will protect its back, so to speak, no? So how can you assure the public of your independence and that you will not be pressured to kowtow to the interests of the government, previous government?
I believe that's a natural expectation. I mean, if you are in the position of the administration, that's what you'd be looking for. I guess the only thing I can say is I think I have a proven track record when I was with the Commission on Audit and the like. Pursuing or protecting for political purposes or political gain was never something we tolerated there. There would be requests for, a special audit, and we would only pursue it if there is really basis. Even if, some politician was trying to pressure us to do it for his own gain, we would always say, pasensya na, hindi, we can't do that. We'd be destroying the institution. So I think that's the most important thing. You want to still establish credibility in the institution. And so if the perception is that, you're just there to protect someone, then it hurts not only yourself, but the institution. So I think that's what I can say. I think I have a pretty decent track record to back me up.
You made mention earlier, you made reference to the SAL-N issue, no, with the former Ombudsman Martires. In 2021, as you probably know, he proposed criminal penalties, no, including imprisonment or fines for anyone publicly commenting on officials' SAL-Ns. Critics, including journalists, lawyers, and legislators, decried this move, no, as unconstitutional. No? Can I have your comment on that?
Probably would be. I mean, the law provides the limitations on the use of the SAL-N by the public. Should be not used for purposes contrary to morals and policy, and shouldn't be used for commercial purposes except for news, media, and dissemination. I get his point to a certain extent because I have personally seen the SAL-N being weaponized. Because the unfortunate thing is, when you present the SAL-N, in public, certain impressions, perceptions already happen. And I think this happened to the Ombudsman himself. I remember there's one columnist who was saying that, from the time he left the Supreme Court until he assumed Ombudsman, his net worth increased by like 15 or 20 million. Now, if you know that as a career jurist, he's entitled to a lump sum pension when he finishes his, or when he leaves. Either, in this case, I think he could do optional retirement, did optional retirement. So, so you would know that, okay, yeah, it's obvious. But the public doesn't know that. And so the impression created is that, there must be something here. And so I can understand where he's coming from. And this is what I think we need to find some kind of balance. I mean, currently, not to offend anyone, but for example, the Supreme Court only releases, I think, highlights. In Congress, to require it, it has to be approved by a resolution of the House. So it's like, okay, you have all these barriers there now, and I guess it needs discussion. Okay, how do we deal with this, but at the same time protect those who are unfairly triggered by it? In fact, to give you one example, I had an employee in Cordillera when I was with the Commission on Audit. And there was this private citizen who kept pestering her for copies of documents of DPWH projects in Baguio. And her response was, no, we can't release that to you because these are not our documents. You can request from DPWH. So what the citizen did was he went to the office of the Ombudsman to check if that employee had her salahen on record. And it wasn't on record in the office of the Ombudsman. And based on that alone, he filed a case against her. If you'll notice in the Ombudsman Act, you could be preventive suspension immediately without notice or hearing. Okay, on the assumption that because there's no record in the Ombudsman that her SALN was filed for that year, she didn't file her SALN. Now, it turns out she did file her SALN with HR, which is the obligation of an employee to file it with HR. It's the HR department that brings it to the Ombudsman. Now, eventually that came out. The case was dismissed. But, well, guess who had to pay the back wages of that employee? Not the Ombudsman. It was the Commission on Audit had to pay it for something they didn't do, for an act that wasn't their responsibility. But I think a bigger discussion needs to be done, and if the law needs to be amended, then maybe that should be the case.
Okay, thank you. For my final question, you serve under the past three administrations, President Pinoy Aquino, President Duterte, and President Marcos Jr. To your mind, which among these administrations had more passion and was more effective in fighting graft and corruption?
Well, if you really look at passion and all, I think that was the whole campaign of President Aquino. Remember kung walang korap, walang mahirap, di ba? That was really his thrust. And I would think that it was quite strong because, as you know, I was a practitioner before I entered government. And, as a practitioner, you're exposed to all sorts of shenanigans in the courts. And I remember talking to a court interpreter, and he was saying that they're behaving now because, it comes from the top. The leadership comes from the top, and it's leadership by example. So if they see that at the top, they seem to be quite serious about it, they take a step back. Now, I think with the President Duterte, he was pretty strong about it, but there were still a lot of things that were going on under his nose. I think the scare tactic worked to some extent, but probably was maybe selectively enforced because, at least from experience when I was in the commission, we dealt with the World Bank and other organizations that were looking at corruption. It was during the past administration that based on at least their survey, which of course we don't know how accurate it is, the percentage of kickbacks increased. That was the data that they provided us. Now, I don't know if the data is fully accurate. Now, with the current president, I think he's probably sincere with it, but he's only 3 years into the term, and so it remains to be seen. The recent moves about the flood control in Sumbong mo sa Pamuno, it's a good start, but it's how you finish that's more important, I think.
That was my final question. Good luck, Chairperson Aguinaldo, and thank you, Attorney.
Thank you.